Good afternoon. My name is Angela Scott, and I'm the chair of the American Bar Association section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. I am pleased to welcome you to our program today entitled Brown at 67, Reflecting and Reimagining. This year marks 67 years since the landmark US Supreme Court ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, in which the court invalidated the doctrine of separate but equal in public education. The Brown ruling has taken on mythic proportions in the public narrative and has seemingly obscured the almost century-long efforts to secure school integration and seek resource equality that preceded the decision. It also overlooks the collateral consequences of the uneven implementation of Brown, including the massive firing of Black educators and school leaders and the closing of many Black schools, and the disproportionate burden borne by Black children to integrate schools. This panel will explore the current state of public education in light of the aspirations of Brown to secure education equality. We still have quite a long way to go, as we know, when it comes to educational equity, and we know that now more than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic has shed light on many of the disparities that still exist. Some children were able to transition to home education with ease, and they had current internet access, technical equipment, laptops, et cetera, to do so. Others were not. Consequently, in many areas throughout the country, we know that this disparity fell heavily on Black and Brown children. We've learned that all resources are not created equal and were not distributed equally. So that's just one example of the fact that while we've come very far, we still have quite a ways to go. So today we are pleased to be able to hear from many great people, our special guest, US Congressman Bobby Scott, and an outstanding panel of experts who will take a deep dive into all of these issues. But before we begin, I'm going to turn it over to Sean D. Burns, who is our Civil Rights and Social Justice Vice Chair of our Education Committee and the Assistant Vice President of our program co-sponsor, the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. Sean will introduce our special guest. Thanks for being here, Sean. And thank you to all of our panelists for what I know is going to be a wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Good afternoon, everyone. As Angela mentioned, I am Sean Burns. I have the pleasure of serving as the Assistant Vice President of Government Relations for the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, one of the sponsors of today's panel discussion. Founded in 1987, the Thurgood Marshall College Fund supports our nation's publicly supported, historically Black colleges and universities and predominantly Black institutions. It goes without saying, my colleagues and I are pleased to execute our mission in honor of the late Supreme Court Justice and a personal hero of mine, Thurgood Marshall. This afternoon, I have the honor of introducing a man who certainly needs no introduction, the Honorable Robert C. Bobby Scott, Chairman of the United States House of Representatives, Committee on Education and Labor. However, I will still offer a few highlights of his stellar service to our nation. A graduate of Harvard College and Boston College of Law, Chairman Scott has represented the Commonwealth of Virginia's 3rd Congressional District since 1993 and has previously served as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates and the Virginia Senate. Without a doubt, Chairman Scott has been a champion of civil rights and social justice. For instance, as a young attorney, Chairman Scott founded the Peninsula Legal Aid Center to assist those who could not afford legal representation. Chairman Scott is a recognized champion of the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights and has fought to protect the rights and civil liberties of all Americans. For instance, in 1997, Chairman Scott protected the right of all children with disabilities to obtain a free and appropriate education under the Individuals with Disabilities Act by leading a successful effort to defeat amendments aimed at curtailing that right for some children. Most recently, criminal justice reform provisions Chairman Scott has long championed were included in the bipartisan First Step Act, a sentencing and prisons reform bill signed into law by President Trump in 2018. These are just a few examples of Chairman Scott's tireless efforts as a true champion of civil rights and social justice. So without further ado, I am honored to welcome the Higher Education and HBCU Community's Leader in Congress and my dear fraternity brother, the Honorable Robert C. Bobby Scott, Chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean, for your very kind introduction. It's very kind of you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Angela, Janelle, David, Sonia, Carol, and Letitia for all that you do to address racial justice in education, and particularly also the entire ABA team for what they do. In 67 years ago, since Brown v. Board of Education, the Education and Labor Committee has played a key role in our nation's progress towards achieving the promise of educational equity. In fact, to combat Southern opposition to the decision, then Chairman of the committee, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., started attaching anti-discrimination clauses to so many education bills that his amendment became recognized as the Powell Amendment. This amendment will become the basis for Title IV of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Recognizing the need to reinforce the 1954 decision, Chairman Powell also helped pass the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. This critical legislation acknowledged that because public schools are generally funded by the real estate tax, to address the funding in low-income areas, you have to invest resources in those areas, and that's what Title I of ESEA does. Despite the original progress made towards fulfilling the promise of Brown in integrating the schools, starting in the 1970s, a more conservative Supreme Court, more conservative Congress regressed to the point where our public schools now are actually more segregated by race and class today than at any time since the 1960s. Now, this segregation just doesn't isolate students, it isolates their opportunities. And this has been shown to isolate their funding. Even before COVID-19, one study showed that funding of public school districts serving predominantly Black students, that funding is significantly less than funding found in districts serving predominantly white students. Now the pandemic has exacerbated inequalities. And this is especially true, as it's already been mentioned, when it comes to distance learning. According to the 2020 GAO report, Black and Latino students disproportionately lack access to computers and reliable home internet necessary for virtual learning. And so the traditional summer slide has been going on for over a year. But today's event is not about what I call celebrating the problem. We're also discussing solutions to address persistent achievement gaps. The federal role in these efforts is to supplement financial support for low-income children to reduce educational resource equities. And as I indicated, that's what Title I does. To that end, I helped pass the American Rescue Plan Act, which provided the most significant one-time federal investment in K-12 education in our nation's history. And to ensure that the funds were targeted by need, this funding is being distributed through the Title I formula. So if you ask wealthy areas how they fared, they're going to be disappointed. And the low-income areas are getting money that they've never seen before. And that's why we need to make sure that they're using that relief appropriately. They need to use it first to comply with the CDC guidelines to reopen their classrooms safely, but at least 20% of the funds must be used towards addressing lost learning time by funding such things as comprehensive after-school and summer programs, extending school days, funding counselors and nurses to support students' emotional well-being, and assistant teachers and smaller class sizes. They can afford this with the money they got through the American Rescue Plan Act. The package is also bolstered by what's called Pandemic EBT program, which has provided nutritional assistance to families who are missing out on free or reduced price school meals. Moving forward, the committee is continuing to work with the Biden-Harris administration to ensure that future relief packages address educational inequities that are steeped in our country's structural racism. As classrooms reopen, millions of students and staff are returning to crumbling and unsafe schools. According to the GAO, More than half of all school districts need to repair major systems in more than half their buildings. And this includes 4 in 10 districts that need to repair or replace ventilation systems in at least half their buildings. And the CDC has identified ventilation as a key element to reopening schools. Accordingly, the Biden-Harris American Jobs Plan includes key elements of legislation I introduced called the Reopen and Rebuild America Schools Act, which provides over $100 billion in grants and bonding authority to address physical and digital infrastructure needs in high poverty schools. Again, distributed by the Title I formula, so it goes where it is most needed. To deal with school segregation, this Congress also reintroduced 2 bills, one, the Strength and Diversity Act, and the other, Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act. The Strength and Diversity Act is a grant program to provide resources to school districts that want to voluntarily develop school integration plans. Because of voluntary plans, as you know, in Seattle and Louisville were ruled unconstitutional, the technical assistance will be obtained under these grants so that localities can develop effective integration plans that can withstand constitutional challenges. The Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act restores the private right of action for students and parents, along with local civil rights groups, to bring Title VI discrimination claims based on racially disparate impact. As you know, the Sandoval decision about 2 decades ago eliminated the private right of action for disparate impact cases under Title VI. And so if the Department of Education doesn't bring the case, nothing happens. I don't have to describe to this group how that worked in the last presidential administration. These are just a few of my priorities to meet the critical moment of our educational system. And as we pass historic relief packages to help school communities recover from the pandemic, we have the opportunity to eliminate persistent funding and achievement gaps, and finally take actions to achieve the promise of Brown. To that end, I look forward to working with the ABA and educational leaders nationwide to finally ensure that all students have access to the lifelong benefits that come with a quality education. So thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the seminar.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you know from listening to the chairman and Sean, we're here to talk, and Angela, we're here to talk about the promise of Brown, the landmark case that outlawed racial segregation in public life and its progeny. So we are joined by an esteemed panel, but before I introduce them, I wish to thank Chairman Scott, longtime champion and tireless advocate of these issues. It's always a privilege to listen to and learn from you, and to have our public officials continuously invested in this critical area. You touched on nearly every issue that is near and dear to our hearts and minds, at the fore of our minds, when I think about those who are on this call. I also would like to thank Angela Scott and Janelle George of the ABA's Civil Rights and Social Justice section, and Ali for helping pull us all together. And I just want to say a couple of words before I turn to the panelists. So we know that 60 plus years ago, all kinds of advocates, lawyers, lawmakers, researchers, social scientists, students, and their families came together around a common cause and goal: to rid this nation of de jure segregation. This on the heels of nearly 4 centuries of legalized racial segregation, which was consistently reaffirmed by courts, local, state, and federal courts and government actors. Although we were able to secure the decision in Brown more than 6 decades ago, the promise of Brown has not yet been fully realized. So here to discuss that and more, I'm going to introduce our panelists. So we have Dr. Sonia Douglas Horsford, who is a professor of education leadership at Columbia University's Teachers College, where she teaches on the politics of race and inequality in education. Dr. Horsford also serves as co-director of Teacher College's Urban Education Leaders Program for aspiring district level education leaders committed to equity, justice, and excellence. She's also founder of the Black Education Research Collective. We also have attorney David Hinojosa, who is currently serving as director of the Education Opportunities Project of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. There, he leads efforts to ensure equal educational opportunities in elementary and secondary schools and institutions of higher education. He's a former attorney and Southwest Regional Counsel for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, also known as MALDEF. He's been litigating cases for quite some time, testified before governmental agencies and bodies, all in the name of access and opportunity. It's good to see you, my old friend. Then we also have attorney Kara McClellan, who is assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, Inc. There, she works on ensuring access to education and efforts to end the criminalization of Black people. She's litigating school desegregation cases, a couple that are familiar to me, and recently authored Our Girls, Our Future, Investing in Opportunity and Reducing Reliance on the Criminal Justice System in Baltimore. I'll say a quick word about myself. I'm thrilled to be here with this esteemed panel, all of you all who are participating on the call, Chairman Scott, Janelle George, Angela, Sean, and I bring a perspective as a former elementary school educator, a researcher, civil rights attorney, and now someone who's in the higher ed landscape. So let's get this conversation started. And I'm going to ask a few questions and then turn it over to the audience after the panel has had an opportunity to discuss some things. So I'd really like to ask you all to discuss what's happening. Let's start talking about what racial segregation looks like today in every sense of the word. What is happening in schools around the country and what are we doing about it? And I'm going to just try to tailor it a little bit. So Attorney McClellan, if you could give some perspective on the impact of desegregation cases and litigation today. Attorney Hinojosa, if you are able to talk to us a little bit about what's happening within schools, so within school segregation. And Dr. Horsford, what the role of the community is in this fight for access. That would be very helpful.
Sure. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm so glad to be here for this important discussion with such an esteemed panel. I'm an attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, founded in 1940 by Thurgood Marshall. We are the organization that litigated Brown v. Board, and we continue to work on school desegregation cases to this day, as well as in the areas of political participation, criminal justice, and economic justice. So the reality, as Chairman Scott has already outlined for us, is that racial segregation in our nation's schools remains a persistent problem that harms all students. And I think we're going to talk about that some more later on. But in answer to your question, I think we have to really focus on, as Chairman Scott outlined, the ways that persistent segregation are limiting resources for Black and Brown students. The reality is that approximately 75% of Black students and 80% of Latinx students in K-12 schools attend racially segregated schools. And I wanted to just talk a little bit more about what does that mean in terms of access to resources. So I'm going to very briefly share my screen just to highlight some statistics. Can everybody see the screen okay? Just double checking. Okay, great. So first we know that high schools with high Black and Latinx enrollment are less likely to offer advanced math and science classes. This is particularly for courses that are required for some universities, like calculus, like physics. We know that Black, Latinx, and Native students are twice as likely as white students to attend a school where more than 20% of the teachers are in their first year of teaching, or where more than 20% of the teachers have not met state certification or licensing requirements. And we know that this impact is huge, that teachers are, access to qualified teachers are a main cause of what we call the opportunity gap. Some people call it the achievement gap, but we really know it's a reflection of opportunity and clearly not ability or talent. Second, we know that this impacts students' access to extracurricular activities, that schools that serve Black, Latinx, Native, and Pacific Islander and Southeast Asian students are less likely to have access to extracurricular opportunities, which impacts, again, academic achievement, but also well-being and psychological development for students. And of course has consequences when applying to colleges and universities. Arts education, schools that serve Black and Latinx students are also less likely to have access to art instruction. One study found that 58% of white youth received arts education compared to 26% of Black respondents and 28% of Latinx respondents. Schools that serve Black and Latinx students are also significantly less likely to have access to recess. The literature and research on this is very well developed in terms of the harmful impact of not having access to recess. And then lastly, for those of us who work in the school discipline and policing space more broadly, Black and Latinx students are approximately 3 times more likely to attend a school with more security personnel than mental health personnel in their school buildings. So I wanted to share all that data, and I know that, and I hope that we will, for most of the conversation, really not be using a deficit framework in terms of talking about the impact of segregation. But I also think it's important to ground ourselves in the data, because what this data shows is that racial segregation in public schools remains a really effective way of hoarding resources and opportunities for white students. It remains the case that segregation is a system through which our country upholds white supremacy by divesting in resources, and funding is part of it, but it's also many other kinds of resources in ways that limit opportunity for students of color, particularly Black, Brown, Native, and Southeast Asian students. I want to just briefly talk about the reality that the research is well documented that segregation harms all students, but also that integration in schools has positive impacts, as we've been talking about, for the opportunity gap, but also more broadly for the development and long-term outcomes for students even after school in terms of career goals and long-term economic outcomes. But there seems to be this popular narrative that is the result of political resistance and racism, but political resistance to desegregation. This myth that desegregation does not work or that it's impossible, and this is false. When desegregation has been enforced, it has had an immediate impact. Desegregation disrupts a system of hoarding resources for white students with the immediacy that only a court order can have. And so in our cases where we have ongoing desegregation orders, we can continue to enforce the end of the system of white supremacy and resource hoarding. And in particular, we just had a case in St. Martin Parish earlier this month where we were litigating this issue, not just in terms of student assignment, but it's also about diversity of faculty throughout a district and staff. It's also about equal access and making sure that the burden isn't borne by just one group, namely Black students, in terms of transportation. As we were talking about, it's also about equal access to extracurricular opportunities and facilities, and then also course assignment, making sure that Black and Brown students in the district have equal access to advanced placement and to mentally gifted programs. And lastly, we also litigate school desegregation cases with respect to discipline, making sure that Black and Brown students aren't being disproportionately disciplined. So I just want to really push back against this myth that desegregation doesn't work. In the regions where we're continuing to enforce desegregation decrees, it has had a substantial impact. And I would just lift up very briefly Chef, which is our desegregation case in Hartford, Connecticut region, because it's an example of how even in places where between district segregation is continuing to be a problem, even that does not have to be accepted as the status quo. In Chef, we have created remedies that are regional solutions so that students can attend schools within other school districts, either through what's called an open choice program there, where you can choose to attend and transfer to another district, or through the choice system of magnet schools that serve multiple districts. So really want to challenge this idea that district boundary lines are another barrier that make desegregation impossible. There's no reason that we have to assume that just because you live within a certain district, you have to attend school there. And we know that the reality is that operating under that assumption perpetuates segregation, because segregation is so tied to city and other district lines at this point. So I will stop there, but really looking forward to this discussion about solutions and opportunities for continuing to push for change.
Thank you, Attorney McClellan, my former LDFer colleague. I litigated St. Martin Parish. And so I am so happy to see that we are still making progress in that case. So I want to turn to you, Attorney Hinojosa, for a moment and just touch on you. I heard Attorney McClellan really talk about all of a school system's operations. We heard Chairman Scott mention them and outline them, a number of them. And I just wanted to ask if you could kind of take us inside a school, if you will, and what you're seeing in the work that you do on a daily basis. And then we'll turn it over to Dr. Horsford after that.
Absolutely. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, the ABA and Chairman Scott. And good to see you again, Letitia, after several years since our last soiree. But I wanted to, again, echo, Kara did touch on, the between school segregation and between school district segregation that still is a persistent problem several years after Brown v. Board. And in fact, the Lawyers Committee filed an amicus brief just last year concerning the continuing segregation problems with the proliferation of charter schools in the state of New Jersey. And we filed an amicus brief on behalf of the Lawyers Committee, as well as several law professors who were very concerned about this growing trend. And while Brown v. Board was looking at more holistically about tearing down those barriers to the schoolhouse doors, what's happening behind those schoolhouse doors is incredibly important. And Kara did touch upon, a little bit of this, as a director of a former Equity Assistance Center that worked with districts in trying to break down, some of their own institutional barriers, including at St. Martin Parish. So we have a little connection there. We were servicing the community of St. Martin Parish and working with that school district. But oftentimes, what happens is when you look behind the schoolhouse doors, there's still separated classes. Many of these might be because of gifted and talented requirements and testing requirements that are born of biasness against certain races and ethnicities. Sometimes it's with advanced coursework, AP coursework. Sometimes they have certain requirements, and it might make sense, for example, if you're trying to take a AP English 4 exam, that you will have taken English 3, but how or why you needed to score X on a certain state standardized test that has nothing to do with your ability on whether or not you can perform well in an AP classroom doesn't make sense. And so schools having to revisit some of those institutional barriers after looking at their data plays a critical point in trying to deconstruct, many of those barriers that exist within a school that is otherwise integrated. And it's something that we and others in the field have referred to as integrated schooling. So it's not just an integrated school, but it's an integrated schooling experience, which of course, would partly entail schools being, or classrooms being more integrated. So where you might have an integrated school, when you look at GT and AP classes, might have a lot fewer students of color in those. But then when you look at in-school suspensions or alternative school settings, within the school, all of a sudden you see a great deal of Black and other students of color in those classroom settings. And I think it's critical, again, to look at, how students are being segregated even within a school. For English learners, for example, who cover, several different races and ethnicities, they not only face, double segregation with income and race, but they have triple segregation, what some researchers have referred to as triple segregation, because it's, not just income, it's not just race or ethnicity, but it's also language. And, about 15 years ago, we saw this actually in Dallas ISD, which is a fairly diverse district, although it's a lot greater in the student of color population. But within the school, Preston Hollow Elementary School, they were using language as a proxy to segregate Black and Latinx students. So they were saying that, there were ESL classes, English as a second language classes. You would think that students in an English as a second language class would not be proficient in English. They would be labeled as an English language learner. But in many of these classes, they were only 10 or 15% of English learners, but they were 90 to 100% students of color. And so they were using language as a proxy to segregate those students. Those cases are incredibly difficult to challenge, as you can imagine, because the bar is set so high with, having to prove, for private actors, having to prove intentional segregation. Now, in that case, we actually did. The case's name, if anybody's interested, is Santa Maria versus Dallas ISD. But that had been, years of practice and policy in creating that climate for those students. And then within those classrooms, what was most distressing is many of the things that you hear that echo from, the Brown v. Board, where there were groups of students who isolated themselves. So there were the Mexicans, the Blacks, and then the neighborhood kids. The neighborhood kids were like in these quote unquote neighborhood classes, neighborhood classrooms. And, but their own discussions, with counselors and with the vice principal showed that they themselves, even though they, had a lot of pride within themselves, felt that they were in the dumber class because they were in the ESL classes as opposed to the neighborhood or general ed classes. So these things, can manifest themselves still today, in many different ways. And I think it's critical, for schools to look behind their doors and to see whether or not there is, true access and opportunity for all those students.
Thank you, Attorney Hinojosa. Dr. Horsford, wanted to turn it over to you. And, what Attorney Hinojosa just left us with was something about the students themselves, the families, the community. If you could pick up there and share a little bit about the role they play or ought to play, and anything else you'd like to add, that'd be fantastic.
Thank you, Letitia, and thank you to the ABA for the invitation to be a part of this discussion. I'm so excited. Brown has been a case that I have really looked at from an education perspective for many years, and I continue to learn so much from the legal community in particular around the cases that have been so important to leading up to Brown, as well as the work that you're currently doing. And so I want to acknowledge that and show my appreciation for, again, the continued struggle for educational equality and justice. As I mentioned, I really want to share my perspective as a qualitative researcher who is seeking to really begin the work of centering the voices of students, of parents, and communities in the research and scholarship that really informs what we do in schools. I would say that much of our focus on advancing equity and opportunity in education has been very closely linked to the expansion of desegregation and diversity, and that there is certainly an opportunity for education researchers in our community to think about the pedagogical and instructional strategies and approaches that can help advance equality and justice. And if I could, I'd like to just take a little bit of time to share my own experiences so that you can get a better sense of where I'm coming from and how I'm hoping that we can really shape the nature of this conversation and the larger efforts to advance equity and justice, particularly for African American and Black children and all other disenfranchised groups going forward. I often get critiqued for being someone who is critical of school integration. And it's not that I don't support integration, I just believe that that will be the evidence of our society being committed to seeing individuals as equals. and that a lot of that work can actually happen in schools, and that schools can really serve as levers for social change and equity. And the way that we do that is by modeling how we can, again, create communities where we're all really a part of a beloved community where we have equal status and there's equal respect for all groups that are in the schoolhouse. I didn't personally live through Jim Crow segregation or attend an all-Black segregated school. I actually went to public schools in Las Vegas, Nevada in the mid-1980s. I won't tell exactly what year. But my classmates represented a very wide range of racial, cultural, and religious backgrounds. My close friends were African-American, white, Mexican, Filipina, Cuban, and Vietnamese, some of whom, like me, represented mixed ethnic ancestry and were children of immigrants whose parents worked in the gaming or hospitality industry, served in the military, or were able to land a government job with good benefits. But many of us served as cultural brokers between our homes, our schools, and the broader institutions that we navigated alongside or on behalf of a parent who spoke Spanish or Korean or Tagalog at home. We may have looked different from one another, but had so much more in common in terms of the pressures of growing up, trying to fit in and hoping to make our parents proud by doing well in school. And we were, in fact, their American dream. But many years later, as a mother of three who wants what is best for her own children, I continue to even wrestle with what constitutes the best type of learning environment and the best type of space for young people to be able to grow and develop, even in a society that does not value their intellect, culture, or humanity. And so I also question how we as a nation make assumptions about the racial composition of our schools, what they should look like, and how that has implications for how integration is defined and what problems it aims to solve. So what do we mean by school integration when, for example, for the first time in the nation's history, the majority of school-age children are students of color? What does an integrated school look like in the current political context where our nation is so divided by race and where, incidents of racial violence are really on the rise, not only within schools among students, but by teachers and those who are responsible for caring for our children? And so how do we, learn from the COVID moment, the really visible examples of systemic racism and police brutality and violence, and what that means for how we view Black children in particular, and their families as full human beings? And what is the role of Black students and families and communities as being part of the discourse around what schools should look like in the education of communities that have been historically, again, disenfranchised and really not intended to receive the education, right? I mean, that's the big part, I think, of what Brown really helped to address, is that there was no intention of really providing an education, a liberal arts education for Black children. So as part of a 50-year retrospective of the Brown decision, 17 years ago now, historian and African-American studies professor Kevin Gaines explored the competing conceptions of integration that emerged in response to the Brown case. In an essay he entitled, "Whose Integration Was It?" Gaines described the concerns expressed by African-American political scientist Preston King regarding the term integration and the misperception that has swirled around its usage by an ally of the cause, in this case, white historian August Meyer, who was white. And King argued that Meyer had, quote, failed to comprehend the difference between integration as the demise of separate Black institutions and desegregation, namely the overthrow of the regime of racial subjugation defined by the exclusion of Black people from, quote, access to power, wealth, education, status, and dignity. He continued, integration had generally described a top-down vision of racial change endorsed by US officialdom, Northern liberals, and the civil rights establishment, a process orchestrated and managed primarily by policymakers who, except bigots and extremists, could possibly object to that exemplary vision of equality and colorblind liberalism. So these conflicting definitions of integration are also evident in the post-civil rights era, borrowing language from the Black freedom struggle for racial justice. A 21st century network of education reformers, policy elites, philanthropists, and social justice advocates represent a new power structure that is largely white and yet wields disproportionate control over the education of children of color and the options made available to their parents and in their communities. And so these modern day, quote, white architects of urban education, like their predecessors, continue to advance a vision of equity and diversity, grounded in the belief that if the Brown decision declared separate schools inherently unequal, the way to address the problem of educational inequality is through integration. But I would argue that this conception remains a dilemma for the cause of racial justice because it fails to acknowledge that Brown, quote, fell considerably short of the structural vision of equality and redistributive justice sought by African Americans. And I think this is what the co-panelists have emphasized, it's really about resources and representation and how we ensure not only that we are comparing the opportunities and the nature and quality of education given to Black children to white children, but rather what does it look like for Black children? How might we reimagine and develop a new vision that is articulated by Black educators, Black educational leaders, researchers, scholars, and all of those who are obviously very concerned about ensuring that we expand and enrich opportunity for children of color. And that freedom from racial violence and subjugation and discrimination is also very much a part of this work, in addition to academic achievement, but looking at the social emotional impacts of the educational experience and what that means. And so I will stop there. I know that there are some other questions, and look forward to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Horsford. So I'm just going to ask a quick question and then start to ask some questions that have come in from the audience. And this one, if you could answer in a minute or two tops. And Dr. Horsford, you've kind of started this, but really just thinking about the future, as we look to the future, you all listed and highlighted many salient issues that we currently face with regard to racial inequity in education. Can you talk about some of the ways, some of the new initiatives you're thinking about and are currently undertaking that you think are promising? Or if not from that perspective, ones that you see others moving on. So lawmakers, policymakers, because some of this for me seems very cyclical. We make progress, we go backwards. We make progress, we go backwards. Sometimes that has to do with who our elected officials are. So I just wanted to see if you all could share a bit about what we need to do as we move to the future and think about, and how you're going about doing that, or how others might. 1 to 2 minutes, and then we're going to the audience.
Sure, I'm happy to start. So one of the things that we're doing at the Black Education Research Collective, we have a study underway where we are asking directly Black students, families, educators, community members, how has COVID impacted you? How has the issues around racial inequality impacted Black education, and what would you like to see come from it? And we already have some great recommendations and suggestions, and it is articulating a new vision where we're thinking about rewriting curriculum. How are Black children and their experiences being included and reflected in the curriculum that is being delivered in schools and school systems? The identification and cultivation of Black educators. That has been something that we have worked to develop a pipeline of Black educators and leaders, but how might we do that in ways where we embed culturally relevant pedagogy and, again, curriculum as part of that recruitment process, and think differently about how we invest in the profession? How do we also continue to provide professional learning and support for those who are already working in schools and have been working in schools for a long time, although they have changed, communities have changed significantly around them. And so how do we equip educators and those who are working directly with our children with the tools that they need to affirm them, again, academically, but also socially and emotionally and culturally? And then thinking about how we really leverage research, policy, and practice partnerships. I think conversations like these, having roundtables where we really think about how we use research, which I would also argue needs to be dramatically shifted as well in terms of the paradigms that we use in our research, but how do we engage in those conversations to come up with solutions to invest resources and make sure that representation is also a very important part of what happens in our schools and the leadership of those schools.
Thank you, Dr. Horsford. And you mentioned the collaboration. That's something we very much saw, which culminated in Brown and that landmark decision, certainly. So that's something that we need to continue to keep at the fore of our minds. Appreciate you sharing those. Attorneys McClellan and Hinojosa.
I was just going to jump in on that point because it's something that we are constantly thinking about, but especially as we think about imagining a new vision for the future, that the need for litigators to work closely with social scientists can't be overstated. I think particularly if we think about the different challenges and attempt to roll back civil rights progress, particularly by centering a concept of merit that is not actually merit and that is not objective, but only undervalues the achievements of students of color. students of color, when we think about all of those different challenges, whether it's, by the Pacific Legal Foundation in the New York context, whether it's what's going on in Fairfax County, whether it's in our higher ed work, as I'm sure David will also mention, this over-reliance on standardized test scores and other quote unquote objective indicators of merit that are in fact incredibly racially biased and only reflect the limitations in terms of opportunity that are based on segregation and other forms of systemic inequality, I think really is leading us to think about how do we redefine merit, but also how do we think more accurately about evaluations of schools and of students in ways that we're hoping to tap in and collaborate with social scientists more on. But how do we think about evaluation and how do we think about merit in ways that are not racially biased and that are not, so based on access to privilege and wealth and other things, but rather that are reflective of the reality that we live in today and the purpose of public education as preparing citizens for democracy and preparing people to live in a racially and otherwise diverse global economy. And so I think that's a lot of what we're thinking about right now and really, again, wanting to collaborate with social scientists on.
Wonderful. Attorney Hinojosa, I don't know if you want to jump in and touch on higher education and just, to Attorney McClellan's point, some of the things that y'all are talking about are seen not only in public education, but also private as well. So these are things that touch the lives of our children everywhere.
Yeah,
Attorney
absolutely. And one of the one of the leading barriers to higher education access and opportunity is your preparation in K-12 schooling. And there is incredibly systemic, inequalities there, still grounded in part on how, boundaries were drawn and how the market forces have impacted, property values, especially those property values in high minority schools and high minority communities. But looking at the higher ed space itself, in trying to preserve access and opportunity and completion, Lawyers Committee is involved in all four of the current, or three of the four, soon to be a fourth with some colleagues. But we're involved in three of the four current anti-affirmative action cases that are filed by the Students for Fair Admissions. And this is part of their legwork to try and push back against opportunity. And perhaps one of the most distressing things, although not surprising things, is about how they're trying to position Brown v. Board, how they're trying to position the Title VI Civil Rights Act, which is to suggest that those only allowed for totally, race-blind policies, that you could ignore all the other inequalities in society in our school. And in fact, in their most recent petition for cert filed with the Supreme Court, they talk about how Grutter v. Bollinger, which was the most recent affirmative action case of affirming diversity, a compelling interest in diversity in higher education. They say that abandoned the principle of racial neutrality that Brown and Title VI vindicated. So now you have this narrative coming from the other side, trying to suggest that Brown v. Board, which was about opening doors to opportunity, about ensuring, that students had access to educational opportunity. And so too is Grutter, yet they're trying to suggest that Grutter and Brown somehow conflict. So I think it's critical in these cases that, the civil rights community still help lift the student voice, because that's what's critical about this. Our organization's position in these cases at Texas, at North Carolina, at Harvard, soon to be Yale, is the representation and helping to lift the voices of students themselves, both prospective students, so high school students who are applying to these universities, but also current students who are reaping the benefits. And then the two-way benefits, right? People seem to suggest, oh, well, how is this going to help make brown and Black kids, feel good? And what are the benefits? There's benefits going both ways. When you're talking about cross-racial relationships and breaking down stereotypes, et cetera, our students have testified on these critical issues in these cases. And it's incredibly important that that be present. But I also want to mention too, something that we're going to be going more fully this Thursday is our Reason Project that is funded by a foundation. And that's looking at these issues of access and opportunity more comprehensively. So it does look at recruitment, but it also looks at engagement. It also looks at climate on campuses in 2 Midwestern states at 2 flagships that have had continuing problems of enrolling and retaining students of color. Because these issues, again, while affirmative action is incredibly important and necessary, it's not the only solution that needs to be pursued to preserve access and opportunity.
Wonderful. Thank you, Attorney Hinojosa. So I'm going to try to incorporate 3 different questions that I've read. And so there are questions about access to special education services. So serving students who have special needs, serving students who are English language learners. And also, I'm going to frame it this way. The school to prison pipeline, so to speak, or access to the classroom when students might be quote unquote challenging. So just take your pick, anybody, just a minute on any of those topics would be great, because I do know we only have a few minutes left before we turn it back over to our friends at the ABA. Sorry, I can do it if you, okay, there you go. All right.
I'm really
I know y'all are talkers.
For an emancipatory vision of education, where we're just, even thinking bigger about what we really can accomplish with our education system. I just think the world has changed so dramatically, and that this is a time where we can really take stock of all of the wonderful talent that we have in the education community, think about how we can invest in that. And again, through partnerships, through dialogue, we can develop, I think, a whole new model of what education can look like, and do it from the ground up and on a foundation that recognizes all of the different communities that we're talking about, including those who have not been a part of that process, to be included from the initial design. And I believe that we have the researchers who can do it. I believe that we have the educators and a future pipeline of educators that can make that happen. And by working together, we can really create something different, and that this is the time to do it.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Attorney McClellan.
I completely agree. I think on the school to prison pipeline, which honestly I think is also connected to the question about services for students, whether in terms of unmet special education needs or otherwise. I think one of the reasons I wanted to share that stat about Black and Latinx students being 3 times more likely to have security personnel than counselors or mental health personnel is because it comes back to how segregation makes it possible to have different visions for what education should be depending on the demographics of a school. And so to me, part of addressing segregation is about ending this ability to have different ideas about what education should look like, what a right to an education should include, depending and varying with our country, depending on who are the students being served within that school. So I agree that we need a new vision for what education should be, that it should be one that is consistent for all students. And I think going back to the conversation at the beginning about infrastructure, when we're thinking about what does a basic right to education look like, that has to include infrastructure in terms of facilities. And I just want to highlight our Baltimore case for a minute, which is a school funding case against the state of Maryland, where we're litigating on behalf of a class of students and families who periodically, when schools were open, would not be able to attend school for a week because there wasn't heat or because there wasn't air conditioning. So thinking about basic infrastructure as connected to a right to an education, thinking about services that should be entitled to all students based on their individual needs, and rejecting this idea that it's okay that we can exclude students for discipline or other reasons that are almost always a reflection of our failures to meet their basic needs, I think is something that is only going to come about when we truly understand that all students deserve a right to an education, no matter the context, no matter the color of their skin.
Thank you. Attorney Hinojosa, a couple words before I wrap it.
Sure, I'll just say very briefly, and this is something that we touched upon the amicus brief that we filed in the New Jersey case. It's a case by the Education Law Center out of New Jersey. And so, there were several charter schools that were under-enrolled with English learners and students with disabilities. The quote, harder to educate, the quote, more expensive to educate students were not being enrolled in several of these charter schools, at least compared to the sending school district, that was a subject of the lawsuit. And it just takes re-examining how and why these schools were designed in a way that either pushed certain students away or didn't welcome them. You can have students, teachers who know how to teach to English learners, who are certified to teach there, and how or why aren't they enrolled in those classes? Why isn't engagement going out in several different languages for the communities that are being served? And what does that language say? Not only are you pushing them away, but how are you welcoming them? And I think, sometimes, it's a rogue clerk, at a school who's sending students away saying, oh, well, you know what, if your kid can't come here, they're not going to get all this special education that they need. But how or why is that? And I think, having to critically re-examine yourselves is that critical first step to ensure an access.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Attorney Hinojosa, Attorney McClellan, Dr. Horsford. I just want to say that something that you all hit on in every answer was really the need to engage different constituents and bring them to the table when you're figuring out what education needs to look like. So asking the families and the students who are part of that system is critically important. Holding public officials, lawmakers, policymakers accountable for the decisions they make, and offering some transparency, significant transparency, whether we're talking about the data, quantitative, leveraging the qualitative data that Dr. Horsford and her colleagues are developing, is very, very important as we think about moving forward and what is going to create equitable systems, racially and ethnically speaking, in this country. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over. Thank you all to my colleagues at the ABA, who are going to show us a short video.
In 1954, the United States Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education declared, "Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship."
Today, it is the principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment.
In these days, it is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education.
Such an opportunity, where the state has undertaken to provide it, is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms.
Brown versus Board of Education is one of the most important landmark Supreme Court decisions in US history. The ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice is building on our association's commitment to public and civics education with its Civil Rights Civic Institute.
The Civil Rights Institute website provides answers to your questions about the rule of law, our Constitution, and our rights as citizens.